Welcome to Foundations of Instructional Delivery, which is Fire and Emergency Services Instructor 1, Chapter 7, Training Safety. The objectives we're going to cover in this class are as follows. We will discuss the relationship between training and firefighter safety. Identify the life safety initiatives that relate to training activities. Describe how to ensure safety in the learning environment. Describe how to promote and teach safety by example. We will also describe the laws and standards pertaining to safety during live fire training, discuss how to develop safety as part of your department's culture, and identify the legal considerations surrounding training safety. Each year in the United States, certainly in other nations as well, firefighters are injured, and on average in the United States, 10 are killed during training-related activities. Unfortunately, this trend has accelerated over the past few years, along with injuries to instructors. So as an instructor, it is paramount. You must take measures to stop preventable injuries and deaths during training. There will always be a certain level of danger, a minimal level of danger during training when you're doing realistic training, like for flashover, for instance. It's very dangerous exercise, but crucial at the same time. So there's always going to be a certain level of danger that will exist if the training is realistic enough to really be effective training. You must always place students' safety ahead of any performance expectations, including by you assigning training officers, by you implementing rehabilitation protocols, making sure there are enough trained eyes to watch the students, and your application of relevant checklists, standards, and control measures to keep the students safe. It is your responsibility to provide this training while keeping your students safe. And that's redundant, but that's because this point is so important for you to make sure that you carry away with you from this training. We're going to talk now about the 16 firefighter life safety initiatives. In 2004, the NFFF brought together fire service experts and leaders to discuss ways to slow the number of line of duty deaths, LODDs. This culminated in 16 initiatives, and the goal was to reduce LODDs by 50% over a 10-year period. These initiatives brought both guidance and motivation to instructors while instructors are developing and conducting training. The instructor is specifically charged with carrying out Initiative 5, which is, quote, develop and implement national standards for training, qualifications, and certification that are equally applicable to all firefighters based on the duties they are expected to perform, end quote. This initiative should be applied every time a course is instructed and in every drill ground evolution that is carried out. One of the most powerful methods of teaching is to lead by examples. The students, the firefighters, look to you as the instructor, and they note things. They make mental notes about how the job should be done. And they're going to mimic your actions and your behavior initially until they understand it thoroughly. So you need to make sure that you're always on your A game and lead by example. Instructors play an extremely influential role in determining the performance of students, not just in class, but ultimately when they carry that training back out into the field. So you must, as an instructor, ensure that your own practices and principles clearly demonstrate safety values. If you do not correct an unsafe practice during training, your students will mistakenly believe that you condone the error. So for instance, let's say you're doing fire department connections and you've got 3 small groups, and you've got one group connecting to the fire department connections and they leave out an important step. And if you don't say anything, the students that are looking on kind of scratch their heads and say, well, I thought, and they pull out their book or handout and look at it and say, well, it says here we're supposed to do X, but the instructor didn't say anything, so I guess we can skip that step. That could be really catastrophic on the fire ground. So you need to make sure that all safety steps, all steps are performed every time. You must set a positive tone and embrace safety as the number one priority. It is the number one priority. Absolutely. In the classroom and on the fire ground, you need to point out where things go wrong in real-world applications. Prior to class, make sure that you survey the environment that you're going to be conducting training in and correct any safety concerns. Safety in the learning environment. Safety during training begins with safety in the learning environment. Make sure you consider the location of your classroom and survey the general learning environment. And ask yourself, are there adequate fire exits? Are there unsafe conditions, like perhaps is there remodeling going on, or it's winter and you've got icy steps outside, etc. And also ask yourself, is the area subject to exhaust fumes, or is there oil on the floor? This is particularly true, of course, if you're doing training at a fire station or perhaps a similar facility. Be sure to evaluate lighting conditions where low or high lighting may create eye strain and also cause there to be poor visibility, not just eye strain, but poor visibility in general, making like a slip and fall accident, for example, more likely to occur. Excessive noise can be a problem, not just in the classroom, but when you're training in a hands-on exercise. It interferes with learning and can cause unnecessary damage to students' hearing. Be sure that you review the physical arrangements of your classroom. And when I say classroom, I don't mean just the classroom itself. I do include that, but also locations where you're going to have hands-on training. So classroom will be used for either type of location. So again, make sure you review physical arrangements of your classroom. Look for unsecured cords and various trip hazards, and make sure that tables, chairs, and other fixtures are in good condition to prevent injuries. At the beginning of your class, be sure that you raise safety awareness with the students. Go over the locations of the nearest fire exit and the locations of fire extinguishers. Be sure to address what to do if an alarm sounds. Have on-call firefighters sit near the exit so they can leave without interrupting the class if needed. Explain the emergency plan if a fire alarm activates. And emulate behavior that you teach and remind your students that safety is paramount. Now, I talked about classroom being both the classroom and a location where you're going to have hands-on training. And we're going to focus here a little more sharply on hands-on training safety specifically. Hands-on training includes all training activities conducted outside of the classroom environment. Whether it's a simple tailboard chat or a full-blown live fire training exercise, this is often the most powerful method of instruction for a student. Unfortunately, this training also produces hazards that must be considered and mitigated. There will be slippery surfaces, sharp or jagged metal, and products of combustion that will be present, and you need to be sure that they're all accounted for and pointed out, and anything that can be mopped up, removed, vented, etc. If those steps can be taken, they absolutely must be. Risk management practices, such as doing what I just stated, need to be applied to limit, reduce, or eliminate risk exposure. And environmental factors such as heat, cold, wind, rain, and storms must be considered as well. In regards to personal protective equipment, lesson plans often specify the level of PPE required, and you may also have standard operating procedures that address this as well. You need to make sure as part of your presentation that you provide a general statement about PPE requirements that are to be donned during training. And be sure that the PPE that you are using and your students are expected to use is the appropriate PPE that's required for a specific drill that's being conducted. The best practice is to always use the same PPE in training as what would be used in the real world. It may be acceptable to conduct ladder drills using helmets, gloves, and boots as opposed to full gear and SCBA in order to reduce heat stress. Again, that may be acceptable. It depends on the particular class and some other factors. Another option may be to begin the session in full levels of PPE and then reduce the PPE after signs of heat stress appear or when the skill has been performed properly. That is, to me, the better option, because then they get a taste of what it's like to be fully donned using their SCBA and under stress. Now, of course, you don't want to push them to the point of heat stroke, so you need to make sure that you're monitoring them carefully. When adaptations are implemented, you must make it very clear to the students that the modification is only allowable in training. So let's say you're doing ladder drills and they're fully donned with SCBAs and full turnout and helmets, etc. And let's say after 45 minutes you allow them to take it off because you notice they're starting to, turn a little bit red or show other signs of heat stress, and You allow them to remove their helmets, fire hood, and SCBA, for example. You must make sure that they are clear that they're only being allowed to reduce this during training, and in the real world it has to stay on. If there is any level of hazard that exists, then the highest level of PPE available should be used. That's always true, training or real world. More is always better when it comes to PPE. Rehabilitation practice in hands-on training. NFPA Standard 1584 requires rehabilitation protocols be established and practiced at training activities that involve strenuous or prolonged operations. You need to be aware of the content of this standard and then apply it. Practices further reinforce the importance of following appropriate rehabilitation practices on the fire ground. Training should always mirror real life as closely as possible. Considerations for rehabilitation practices with hands-on training include the following: medical care and monitoring, hydration, and cooling and warming materials. Do not overlook the importance of instructors participating in the rehabilitation process. It is another important way to set the proper example for students. And as an instructor, you're just as vulnerable to the same types of stresses as your students. So all instructors must be monitored for dehydration, heat stress, and general fatigue. The rehabilitation rotation for instructors should be included in the training plan. We're going to discuss safety policies and procedures for training now, and that is the next 8 slides. So this is extremely important, as is everything we cover, but this is extremely important for you to pay close attention to, especially when reading your text. So let's get into it. Your role as the instructor mandates that you have a firm grasp of safety policies that are mandated by your fire department. All safety policies required on the fire ground must be reinforced and practiced during training. A common cause of injuries during training is failure to follow established safety practices. The instructor is responsible to ensure that all policies of the department are followed during training. This includes use of the incident command system, fire ground accountability, rehabilitation, and full use of PPE. You must, as an instructor, enforce policies in the same manner a safety officer or incident commander would at a live emergency incident. There are times when personnel from another agency might train with you if you are conducting mutual aid training or a special course. You must outline, as the instructor, all safety policies and procedures that will be used during a specific training evolution. If you are the host, point out that all visitors must follow your facility's policies and practices. Firefighters from other organizations that are participating in interior training evolutions should have a signed letter from their chief or employer stating that they have met the requirements of NFPA Standard 1403 and Standard 1582. This documentation can reduce liability. You are responsible for drafting and forwarding policies relating to training through the chain of command, including the following: procedures for instructor qualifications, PPE for students and instructors, safe student-to-instructor ratios, effective rehabilitation practices, and all applicable safety points. All levels of instructor must develop, deliver, and enforce training with a strict zero-tolerance policy for deviations from the accepted safety standards or practices. There is an example of a training safety plan that is here on this slide, but the full size is on pages 163 through 165 in your text. Make sure to review it closely. Even though I've got them in the slides here, you can't really read it very well. Review the full-size copy in your text. This is, again, figure 7.4, pages 163 through 165 in your text. Review this training plan closely. This is the second page that is on 164 in your text, second page of your training safety plan. And this is the third page, and this is on page 165 in your text. As an instructor, you must be informed of and follow manufacturer's recommendations for using equipment. Make sure to read the appropriate and accompanying owner's manual for each piece of equipment that has one. There are often injuries that occur if a tool is used in some manner other than what is intended. When a new apparatus is delivered, you should be present for initial training by the apparatus builder. And you need to make sure that you record, practice, and reinforce information that is given to you by an apparatus builder, something you've gleaned from owner's manuals, etc. Now, you can influence a safety culture through training. Constantly remind yourself that you serve as the role model of a safe and effective firefighter. Everything from your fitness level to the way that you wear your uniform should exemplify your values that are related to safety and adherence to its rules. The examples that you set send a much more powerful message than any content that you teach. Be aware of how influential a role the fire and emergency services instructor plays, especially with new firefighters. Whatever you do or say will be construed as the right thing. Faulty knowledge will become dangerous on the emergency fire ground. The primary responsibility during a drill or training exercise is to ensure the safety of all students attending the drill. The actions of a firefighter on the fire ground are the result of the quality of training and safety, attention to safety paid through their training. If you allow students to use unsafe practices in training, they will dangerously repeat those same actions on the fire ground. The responsibility that stands above all others is to make students practice safety during training. So your highest responsibility is to ensure the safety of all, yours and all, that participate during the training. The next responsibility in regard to instructor responsibilities that stand above all others is to make sure that the students are practicing safety during training. You must correct poor skills or bad decisions as they occur. And if you do not correct the student's error or errors, you are reinforcing the incorrect behavior. Constant monitoring and correction is crucial for new recruits. If you're correcting an unsafe skill, it should be the same whether the firefighter is a raw recruit or a seasoned veteran. Let's talk about planning safe training. We've talked about in previous chapters the importance of preparation and planning, and here we're going to focus on planning for safe training. Make sure that this is something that is addressed, or safety is addressed at the earliest stages of course development and your preparation for the course while formulating or modifying lesson plans. Now, if you are instructor 1 and you're using a regular lesson plan that's been provided for you, if you're having to adapt it for your specific facility, then make sure that all of the safety factors that are built into the curriculum are there, but make sure that they also meet any SOPs that may be in place or will be in place for the facility that you're holding the training in. Make sure as an instructor that you analyze and critique the training to ensure that the safety measures are correctly addressed and emphasized. It's too late to address a safety issue after an injury, so prevention is much easier, but it does require a thorough review by you before training starts to ensure that nothing is left to chance. Make sure when you're planning your training that you consult NFPA Standard 1500. Note that almost all NFPA standards in the 1400 series focus on providing safe training sessions. And NFPA Standard 1584 is also a valuable resource. Remember this important point, creating a safety-conscious student must be a primary goal of nearly all training, but I want to footnote that by saying that creating a safety-conscious student helps create a safety-conscious firefighter. When you're determining the appropriate level of protective gear to use, you should consider the following. First, is the PPE necessary to ensure students' safety during a training activity? You need to also ask whether not using full PPE will make training safer. Consider whether not wearing full PPE will create a false perception that real scenes can be safely mitigated without use of PPE. And then also ask yourself if a decision you make regarding PPE is truly in the best interest of the student. Each consideration should be evaluated prior to making a determination of the level of PPE to be used. Safety must be the first and foremost consideration to ensure the lives and safety of all. An important part of the planning process is determining how many instructors are needed. Consider the following: the type or risk level of the training and the skill level of the students. They're not mutually exclusive. Both of these things should be considered. With high-risk training, This involves live fire evolutions in an acquired structure, and another example of high-risk training is swiftwater rescue training. Some examples of medium-risk training would be fire extinguisher training or ladder evolutions. And a couple of examples of low-risk training would be classroom lecture or knot tying, for instance. Here you see examples of each. On the far left, you have example of high-risk training, which is swiftwater rescue training. In the center, you see medium-risk training, which involves here ladder evolutions, and on the far right, you have low-risk training, low-risk training involving knot tying. Skill levels involve new recruits and veteran firefighters. Your consideration for high-risk training of new recruits includes different concerns than high-risk training with veteran firefighters. Other areas of planning include assembling needed equipment. Old or outdated equipment is sometimes used for drills. This can lead to preventable injuries. A tool or apparatus should not be used in training if it does not meet performance standards. As an instructor, you should question whether the outdated equipment effectively teaches students what they need to know. To wrap up the topic, planning safe training, the following points are included. The instructor is also responsible for inspecting all equipment used in training to ensure that it meets required standards prior to drill. Do not assume, never assume, that equipment is in safe and operable condition. Make sure that you acquire the appropriate content in terms of all of the equipment that you need before the drill so that you can inspect it all. Instructors cannot overlook the psychological dangers that students encounter during training, both in and out of the classroom. So we've talked about all of this emphasis on physical training. It can also cause mental strain or distress. Most students realize that their performance is being evaluated both by their instructor and by fellow classmates. A failure can label a student as incompetent or not to be trusted. This type of situation is particularly dangerous because firefighters are driven by a need to succeed. It can also set the stage for disaster if a firefighter is placed in an overwhelming situation with classmates watching. This can lead to injury. Instructors have the responsibility to construct the learning environment so that such situations do not arise. As an instructor, be sure to not minimize levels of performance or drop benchmarks so that every student can achieve success. This is not realistic. However, do not stand by idly if a student cannot perform successfully without exposure to harm. Absolutely. If they are given multiple opportunities and they simply cannot perform a certain exercise or skill set successfully without exposing themselves or others to potential harm, that needs to be addressed immediately. Sometimes as an instructor there are obstacles that must be overcome. One is money or funding to provide all the necessary things to provide quality training may be an obstacle. Instructors often face demands to train students given limited or very limited resources. However, there is one quality that the fire service has, and that is that the fire service is often very creative in developing methods to train with minimal cost and without compromising safety. If you are using something other than equipment or products normally used in the evolution, do be sure that they will not produce a safety hazard. An adequate number of personnel must be present to conduct training safely. This is particularly true in live fire training. This is one of the most hazardous drills, obviously. An analysis of the audience will help you select the best method of instruction for training sessions. A demonstration may be appropriate for entry-level or new skills training. Make sure that you are reviewing the desired outcomes with key safety behaviors that are more applicable for experienced firefighters. Now we're going to talk about live fire training. Safety considerations during live fire training should be the highest priority for all instructors involved with this type of high-risk training. NFPA Standard 1041 now contains language on live fire training instructor requirements. NFPA Standard 1403 describes all aspects of the training process involving live fire training, including positions that must be staffed and prerequisite training that students must complete. Neither of those can be shortchanged. NFPA Standard 1403 applies to all types of live fire training. It includes the permit process, pre- and post-training, and documentation of the training process. This standard must be consulted before the live burn exercise, and it must be followed to the letter when conducting live fire drills. Continuing with live fire training, do not attempt any drill with anything less than a full complement of trained and qualified staff. There must be a fully qualified and trained safety officer present for live fire training. The instructor in charge is required to plan and coordinate all activities and is responsible for following NFPA Standard 1403. An ignition officer is responsible for igniting and controlling material being burned, and they must be present. Note, if an instructor is serving as an ignition officer, they cannot do that for more than one evolution in a row. So they're limited to one evolution as an ignition officer, because that is all the ignition officer does. They are solely focused on igniting material being burned and controlling it. That's a very intense activity and also fatiguing, very tiring. So it is important that they only serve a single evolution. Continuing with live fire training, NFPA Standard 1403 maintains a checkoff sheet to assist the instructor with all aspects of preparation and execution of live fire training exercises. A proper student-to-instructor ratio when conducting live fire training is recommended to be 5:1, and that is in NFPA Standard 1403. This 5:1 ratio is the way that the typical span of control is not exceeded. Any agency conducting live fire training is responsible for identifying the qualifications of instructors who direct and conduct live fire training. Each instructor who carries out any functions of live fire training should possess proper qualifications and certifications. To conclude our segment on live fire training, NFPA Standard 1403 identifies specific positions to be staffed during live fire training. This same safety mindset should apply during any type of high-risk hazard training. Having an experienced instructor in charge with appropriate safety officers and a low student-to-instructor ratio will enhance a safe training environment and promote a safety culture. Let's discuss other training considerations. If a particular position is not filled, then the incident commander or IC is responsible for completing all functions of that position. Although normal ICS procedures allow tasks not delegated to be performed by the IC, NFPA Standard 1403 requires that, quote, the safety officer shall not be assigned other duties that interfere with safety responsibilities, end quote. If company officers are available to assist, responsibilities associated with positions must be covered in depth before training. Be sure to pay attention to detail. Walk through the evolution during planning. Then draw upon your own experiences or case reports of actual incidents during each type of evolution to help identify potential issues and therefore minimize them. This will allow you to create backup plans or eliminate hazards altogether. If you are leading training, for example, disaster drills, where you have students from multiple agencies who may be involved, asking for assistance from others who have led such training will provide good collective support. Run through each aspect of the session, asking yourself, quote, what might go wrong here? And then consider the weather, topography, equipment, and any other potential variables. Be sure to employ additional instructors if there are extreme temperatures that are expected, qualifications or skill levels of students are unknown, which could require more one-on-one time. You have large groups that will participate, training that takes place over a long duration, or training that involves complex evolutions and procedures where additional instruction and safety oversight may be valuable. Fire and emergency services instructors are in a position to select personnel to assist with training programs. Often, company officers are used to help deliver the session or watch over a skill being evaluated. As an instructor, you have the responsibility to know about the people you are asking to help, such as what are their qualifications, etc. Despite your best efforts to keep training safe, you cannot be everywhere at all times, so you must rely on other instructors to help supervise. Continuing with developing a safety culture, instructors that are not confident in or competent with a subject should not be placed in a situation where they attempt to teach that subject. It poses a potentially very serious safety risk. You must assess the motivation of subordinate instructors. Instructors who like to show off or prove superiority are motivated by ego and are not focused on the students or safety in general. Make sure you know your staff, their attitudes towards safety, the way they operate on the fire ground, their motivations for being instructors, and their teaching methods. All support personnel should be included in this kind of assessment. Let's talk now about anticipating problems. As part of preparations, you need to assess potential problems and rectify them prior to training evolution. Train yourself to pick out hazards at a first glance. Foresee the potential consequences and take steps to address hazards. The more fireground experiences you have, the better you will be at recognizing small details that might escalate into a full-scale disaster. Be sure to apply firefighting experiences to every evolution instruction. Tell your students what can go wrong, what to watch out for, how to be prepared for changing conditions, and how training compares to the real thing. Often training tragedies are not the result of a single catastrophic event, but usually are a culmination of several small safety violations. Changes in wind or weather, crew fatigue, or student motivation may also affect an evolution. Your guard must stay up until the evolution is complete. Escalation can occur so rapidly that you cannot regain control. If you see a potential hazard, you must correct it immediately before it gets out of hand. Now let's talk about accident and injury investigation. Despite thorough preparation, an accident may occur nonetheless. It is important to conduct a comprehensive investigation. A key factor in any investigation is the attitude of investigators. The purpose is not to assign blame. If the main focus is on finding cause, then individuals will be more honest and open. Investigations should include the following: the date and location of the incident, the events prior to and during an incident, the equipment involved, PPE in use at the time of the accident, the personnel present, and a written statement from all witnesses. This collective information will help the investigator determine the cause of injury, enable the agency and training personnel to prevent future occurrences. Make sure to keep all injury investigation notes, doctor's reports, and any information generated during the investigation on file. Periodically review these files for any emerging trends. Modify your training program accordingly. If you see a trend, you got to change how you conduct the evolution. There are student responsibilities for safety during training as well. Every student has a stake in ensuring their own personal safety. Each student is responsible for their own actions as well as the actions of other crew members, training team members, and fellow students. Students should be knowledgeable about the training taking place and meet all prerequisites specified before participating. Improperly prepared students can contribute to the injury of fellow students. Students should adhere to all PPE requirements specified and wear all other assigned safety devices or equipment. Each student should be honest regarding his or her own strengths and weaknesses. If a student is not prepared, he or she should notify the instructors so that others are not at risk. Now there are legal considerations. Instructors are held accountable for planning, lack of planning, adherence to standards and codes, and decision-making during the training process. The instructor has the responsibility to keep themselves informed about all laws and standards governing training and safety. Instructor networks, websites, and electronic bulletin boards are all methods of staying up to date. The standard of care or best practices relating to training safety may be tied not only to standards like those set by NFPA, but your department's SOPs as well. Another legal test that may be applied to training is the, quote, reasonable person, unquote, concept. This standard tests your decisions against the decisions made by others with similar training and background. Now, there is always the incidence of negligence, misfeasance, and malfeasance. Generally, there are two types of wrongs that can be alleged in civil cases when an injury occurs. First is unintentional conduct, best equated to the term accident, which is negligence or misfeasance, or conduct that includes an element of intent or knowledge that a wrong is being committed, which is malfeasance. What constitutes negligence or misfeasance and what constitutes malfeasance depend on the facts of each situation. The determination is based on the following: conduct, department rules and regulations, prior training, and national guidelines. In regards to negligence or misfeasance, these terms are void of the element of intent. They are based on the duty to prevent harm or injury to others by exercising a degree of care commensurate with the task being performed. Negligence and misfeasance, continuing with that, negligence exists when there is a breach of duty owed to another, there is an injury, or a breach which is approximate cause of the injury. Once these three elements are established, you can become legally liable for your conduct. Liability equals responsibility in terms of law. If a person or entity is found liable, that person or entity responsible for paying damages or is responsible for paying damages caused by actions or inactions. Remember, liability equals responsibility. If a person or entity is found liable, that person or entity is responsible for paying damages caused by actions or inactions. Note, if you are found liable for damages in civil court while acting as an instructor and you acted outside your recommended guidelines, you solely will be responsible for damages, not the agency you represent. The instructor's conduct is judged according to a reasonable person standard, which is an objective standard. Reasonableness gleaned from the department's policies and procedures, national standards, and federal state law is applied. It is important to remain apprised of changes in that law that affect fire service, and it is also important that any changes in laws or guidelines be incorporated into department SOPs. Misfeasance is most commonly encountered type of wrong in the performance of otherwise lawful acts. It consists of improper or wrongful performance of a lawful act without intent. Most states offer some level of protection to public employees against lawsuits premised on claims of negligence or misfeasance, and there are often immunity laws. With negligence and misfeasance, there's usually required a high standard of proof, which is willful and wanton conduct, gross negligence, which is an act or failure to act so reckless that it shows a conscious, voluntary disregard for the safety of others, which is extreme but not the intentional conduct, and whether a particular act constitutes willful and wanton conduct or gross negligence depends on the facts. It is vital that policies, procedures, and training evolutions be reviewed annually. Now we're going to conclude with negligence and misfeasance. Legal exposures exist in many training sessions that you will teach or participate in. In the event of any accident or injury, training records and the history of participants may be examined. Many instructors fail to realize the importance of documentation. When shoddy records are exposed, professional reputations suffer. Plus, remember that these records are legal documents. Training developed from established reference sources based on up-to-date SOPs are fundamental to ensuring legally defensible training. Now let's discuss malfeasance. This is more than a simple mistake or accident. It is unlawful conduct despite the knowledge that the conduct is illegal and contrary to duty. Many NFPA standards in the 1400 series provide guidance in the application of different types of training exercises. If the department does not adopt this information as standard practice, the failure to do so might be held against the department in a lawsuit. Continuing with malfeasance, most safety protocols that govern training are embedded in broader laws. There are many requirements for live fire training that must also be applied to skills training. Although NFPA standards are not laws, you can be held accountable for adhering to them. Why? Because they're considered standard firefighting practice across the United States. Strictly adhering to all recognized standards and laws will ensure that the training is conducted in a manner that is safe for all participants. If the training will involve participants from other departments, additional documentation should be obtained. This should enter a hold harmless and indemnification agreement with other departments or agencies involved. And this holds that your department is not monetarily or legally liable for injuries or conduct. It is necessary to protect your department from individuals over whom you have no control. Also verify all outside participants. Make sure they are medically cleared, that they have the necessary prerequisites, and that they possess the proper credentials. Off-site training is filled with additional risks. Perform a site inspection in advance. Verify with other entities that proposed training does not violate any law or create unreasonable risk, and then document conversations. Concluding with malfeasance, laws and standards are intended to keep firefighter training in a framework of safe practices. Instructors have the responsibility to keep training safe and follow procedure. The standards, rules, and laws established for safe live fire activities must be adhered to during skills training as well. Okay, class, let's go through a summary of everything we covered in this chapter. We talked about how you must always place student safety ahead of any performance expectations for the training session. The 16 firefighter life safety initiatives should provide both guidance and motivation to you while you are developing and conducting any training. They highlight the importance of training as a strategy that can help reduce the number of firefighter line of duty deaths. As the instructor, you serve as a role model for students. For this reason, you should always reinforce safety policies as part of the teaching process. Safety during training begins with safety in the classroom first. In hands-on training, risk management practices must be applied to limit, reduce, or eliminate risk. And remember, we talked about that as an instructor, you must always wear the PPE required for the drill being conducted. The appropriate level of PPE depends on both the potential hazards and your department's SOPs, and can also be influenced by an NFPA standard as well. Training should mirror as closely as possible the actual fireground operation. Medical care and monitoring, hydration, and cooling warming materials are just a few of the rehabilitation considerations that are required to be available during live fire training events. Knowledge of the department's safety policies and the manufacturer's recommendations for any equipment is the key to keeping students safe during training. The example that you set as an instructor sends a far more powerful message to your students than the theories and concepts that you present in the lecture or drill. And we talked also about how you are responsible for inspecting the equipment that's being used in training to ensure that it meets the required standards prior to conducting the drill. Do not assume that the equipment is in safe and operable condition. Live fire training is the pinnacle of all firefighter training, but it is also one of the most hazardous drills. We also brought up NFPA Standard 1403, which is the standard on live fire training evolutions. That is the nationally accepted standard for all live fire burn training. And we also talked about NFPA Standard 1584, which is the standard on the rehabilitation process for members during emergency operations and training exercises. And that requires that rehabilitation protocols be practiced at training events that involve strenuous or prolonged operations. Instructors are responsible for both the physical and emotional well-being of students while in training. And lastly, we talked about how instructors are held accountable for their planning and adherence to standards and SOPs during the training session. As always, class, thank you for your attention and for your time. Remember, this is a supplemental tool to assist you with the content that's in your text. Make sure that your primary focus is on the text itself. And as always, if you have questions about anything, be sure to contact your instructor. Again, thank you for your time, and we will see you next chapter.